MapleStory is an MMO that has been around for nearly 20 years at this point, and in that time it's seen a lot of interesting things. Too many glitches to count, a player base that has grown up with the game, a lot of lost or forgotten content, and an era where it seemed as though Nexon was on the verge of shutting down the game in the West until they managed to save it with one swift, clever move. There's a good chance you've seen an Iceberg video before, or are at least familiar with the concept. I'll be covering each of the topics outlined on this image, which I made myself based on the very few Iceberg images I was able to find for MapleStory. You can find a link to the full-size version in the description. Most of the entries for this iceberg were ideas or suggestions from other people. All I did was reorganize them and put them together in a more cohesive way, as well as removing and adding topics as I saw fit. This is one of the biggest videos I've ever made, and making it was a very time-consuming and labor-intensive process. Dozens of hours of research and organization. Hell, even writing the script took weeks on its own, so if you appreciate the effort, leave a like and subscribe. I would greatly appreciate it. There's not much to say to introduce this video, so sit back and enjoy as I discuss an admittedly very large iceberg for an admittedly very large game. Level 1. The music. This is a pretty broad topic, but the music in MapleStory has always been widely considered to be excellent. Even in the early days, when it was comprised entirely of low-quality MIDI tracks and there were only a few dozen of them, they were all memorable and nostalgic enough to sit in our minds for years. There's really not much more to say about the music, honestly, but feel free to go check out some of the mixes and playlists that people have put together. I think you'll be surprised to find how much great music there is from MapleStory. A little deeper on the iceberg, we'll cover some of the music that was originally used and then ultimately scrapped for various reasons. CeCe Please. CeCe Please means change channels please. It's a term used commonly by MapleStory players even to this day. In the game, there are channels, which function as instances of the server. Usually people say this when they're trying to train at a map and someone else comes onto that same map in that same channel, with CeCe Please being the colloquial way to ask someone to change channels so as to not interrupt you. This phrase has become quite iconic surrounding MapleStory, and I'm sure you've heard it a lot, even if you've only played MapleStory like a little bit when you were younger or something. Drop game. This is the first topic wherein we have to go way back to old school MapleStory. In the early days, players would run and participate in these drop games, which was mostly a means to scam players out of items, but not always. A drop game is really as simple as it sounds. Person 1 stands at a certain distance away from Person 2. Person 2 then drops an item and tries to loot it as fast as possible, while Person 1 attempts to walk over and grab it. It goes a little bit beyond this sometimes, as you can see in the footage that I'm playing right now, but that's not where it ends. Oftentimes, especially in the early days before players caught on, there was a specific drop game scam that players would try to utilize. In the Hinesis skincare building, there's a spot where the wall covers any players that stand behind it, making it impossible to see them unless you were to click in that spot and see their character info. Using this hidey wall, people were able to work together to scam the unsuspecting victim out of their items with ease. There was no pressure on Person 1 in this instance to actually try and loot the item because Person 3 would be hidden while also being so close to the victim that they were able to walk out and loot any dropped items instantly without giving the victim any time to react. Oftentimes, however, scammers wouldn't play their hands too early and instead played the drop game a few times in order to build confidence and convince the victim to drop increasingly more valuable items until eventually they dropped something that was worth stealing. The scammers would instantly change channels or log out after getting their hands on this item and split the profits. Obviously, though, this scam was easy to avoid. If a player insisted on playing a drop game with you in specific maps, you could just click the hidey spots and you'll know instantly whether there's someone there or not. There were a few common maps that were used for this, but regardless, drop games were dumb ways we passed the time back in the day, as well as a vessel for some scammers to make easy mesos off of unsuspecting victims. Party quests. Mostly prevalent in older versions of the game and slowly disappearing after the Big Bang update, party quests were effectively the WoW dungeons of MapleStory. You had your Kerning PQ, your Ludibrium PQ, your Ludibrium Maze PQ, which was different than the normal Ludibrium PQ. You had Orbis PQ, you had Romeo and Juliet Pirate PQ, Crimsonwood Keep PQ, Ellen Forest PQ, Amoria PQ, and many more. There were a lot of these, and they were some of the favorite pieces of content among players. They gave great rewards, great EXP, and were a social activity, all of which are very important aspects of successful MMO content. As the game changed over the years, this content sort of fell by the wayside and received less and less attention until they turned into what they are nowadays, which is little more than a novelty that's only accessible on a rotation. This is one of the most common things people discuss when it comes to old school MapleStory, and for good reason. Party quests were great, and while they weren't the fastest way to level often, they had other benefits that heavily outweighed the loss of leveling speed. I remember coming home from school and doing Ludi Maze PQ for hours at a time to get 1% EXP per minute. That was a lot in the mid-50s back in 2008, trust me. Exchange quests. In old versions of MapleStory, there were NPCs you could talk to who would take monster drops, the etc. items, in exchange for small amounts of EXP and a random reward. There were a few different iterations of this in different continents and areas in the game, but we'll talk about Orbis exchange quest for now. Each monster's etc. items had a separate exchange pool, so some items were more valuable than others since you could potentially roll valuable scrolls. This system actually still exists in current MapleStory, but is sort of useless nowadays for a variety of reasons, and kind of only serves as a relic of the past. When leveling from 1 to 30 was a lot more time intensive, rich players would simply buy a large amount of junk etc. items and turn them in over and over for the easy EXP. This was the fastest EXP rate up until around level 50, I believe, assuming you had the resources to turn in thousands upon thousands of etc. items, which absolutely did not come cheap. This was considered a luxury leveling method, and most people never did it beyond the early 20s so that they could then access Kerning PQ and to get back to leveling the normal way. The cost of going to level 21 wasn't insane, and it was actually quite efficient, though some people would go to level 25 or so, since killing the mobs in Kerning PQ could be difficult for some classes at lower levels. Jump quests. This is a topic I think most MapleStory players will be familiar with. Jump quests, or more accurately, platforming challenges, are pretty straightforward. If you've ever played a game with precision platforming, you're pretty much familiar with what a jump quest is. A long time ago, they were more of a main focus than they are today, though they still exist. EXP was hard to come by, so players, especially younger players with short attention spans, would opt to acquire their levels into EXP through means other than grinding, such as party quests and stuff. And one of these methods was jump quests. Pretty much any jump quest in the game was repeatable for a small reward, and they were very challenging, particularly as a child. I feel like there are probably a lot of people out there who hear the term jump quest and cringe at the hours they spent trying to clear the Forest of Patience. Dexless Sin. So now we finally get to talking about the classes a little bit. Sin is short for Assassin, which is the second job advancement of a rogue who uses throwing stars. It was one of the most popular classes in 2006, and it's still one of the most popular classes even in 2023. It's kind of unprecedented. Classes in this game have a main stat, which for Assassins is Luck, and a secondary stat, which for Assassins is Dex. Both stats were required to equip the class-specific items for many years, until an update that changed all items to only require primary stat, but that came much later. The first iteration of Dexless Sins would scroll all their gear for luck while keeping their dex at the absolute minimum of 25, which was required to get your job advancement. While it's true that back in the day you needed secondary stats to equip your class gear, there were a number of all-class items that required no stats and could be scrolled to further increase luck, which is what Dexless Sins would use. Your average Dexless assassin from 2007 would look something like this: a luck bamboo hat, a blue or red sauna robe scrolled for luck, black snowshoes, likely unscrolled, a pink adventurer cape which gave weapon attack and could easily be scrolled for luck, increasing its value further, and a maple claw or maple condyle. All of these items required no stats and were so good that they could take you to level 90 or so before you had to consider getting real normal gear. However, once the level 64 Maple Skanda was released, this build became so good that you would often find every pre-4th job Nightlord using some variation of this gear setup. It only started to fall off after reaching the early 120s, so for the vast majority of players who would never reach that point, this was the meta. Eventually though, the real high-level Nightlords who went beyond 120 or 130 or so would switch to a build where they put a few more points into their secondary stat in order to equip higher level gear that they needed to really optimize their damage. Assassin wasn't the only class to have this extreme meta of no secondary stat. There were also luckless mages, dexless warriors, and strengthless archers, to name a few. These were all the meta for a very long time and were all objectively stronger than building your character's stats the way the game intended for you to. It's kind of a pitfall of a very old MMO's misguided design philosophy, and optimizing your stats to make sure you're getting as much as possible primarily served as a barrier to entry, since resetting the ability points you invested in your secondary stat was very expensive, and newer players wouldn't likely be aware of this meta. Overall, it's a fun memory thinking back to that time, but nowadays with secondary stats no longer being required to equip gear, things are way better. Pink Bean. If you look at any advertising for MapleStory, you'll notice that Pink Bean has become a kind of mascot for the game, but his existence is more than just mascot. First released in 2009 with the addition of Temple of Time, Pink Bean held the spot as strongest boss in the game for quite a while. It dealt insane amounts of damage, it was the first boss to introduce the damage reflect buff, and it dropped the materials required to craft the best-in-slot timeless weapons. HP washing was mandatory in the early days for most classes to do this boss, and it was the last major boss added before the Big Bang update. Hinnyhose. Hinnyhose is a term used to describe a person who spends all or most of their time playing MapleStory, sitting around in Hinnesis talking to their friends. It's not really a derogatory term, it's the kind of thing where the people who do it call themselves that, so it's not really used as an insult. These characters are usually covered in NX and generally have very low levels due to not actually playing the game. Hinnyhose usually prefer to experience MapleStory as a social game, and the culture of Hinnyhose still exists to this day. Just go to Hinnesis in just about any server and you are likely to find a few. GM events. GM events were events game masters in MapleStory used to hold at various times, most frequently around the game's anniversary. The events took place in Lith Harbor, Orbis, Ludibrium, and sometimes South Perry on Maple Island. They varied from a difficult jump quest, a true or false game, a hide-and-seek game, and a coconut collection competition. Players would receive a prize for participating in these events. Every player who participated would receive an event trophy, which is a rare collectible only obtainable via GM events, and the winners would receive a Scroll of Secrets. The Scroll of Secrets could be used to begin a sort of fetch quest that, once completed, would reward the player with a variety of items. A few ores, a couple potions, or much more valuable items such as scrolls and high-level weapons and armors. One of the most interesting GM events, though, was called Monster Invasion. During the Monster Invasion events, GMs would summon very powerful boss monsters, and players had to work together to defeat them. The bosses gave the same amount of EXP and had the same drops as normal, so it was possible to get some good stuff from them, though it would have been unlikely with the number of players around. This event was extremely rare, though there were periods throughout the game's history where they were summoned multiple times over a period of about a week or so, usually announced beforehand as an event. GM events, weirdly, were not something I ever personally experienced. I'm not sure if it was just coincidence that I missed them all, or if they were available and I just opted not to participate, but I have absolutely no memory of any of these. Leeching. The term leeching refers to acquiring EXP and sometimes mesos from another person in your party while you do nothing, i.e., leeching from that person's work. The practice of leeching was, for a long time, extremely meta. During the period of time after 4th Job was released and before Magician Ultimates were nerfed to have a cooldown, leeching was the most effective way to level up for any class at almost any point in the game. To explain how this worked and why it was so efficient, let's start with discussing Magician Ultimates. Prior to 4th Job's release in 2008, Magicians were kind of weak. Only Ice Lightning Mages and Fire Poison Mages had any chance of being able to kill monsters normally, and even then they were considered weaker than pretty much any other 3rd Job class. Priests were extraordinarily good overall though, because they had the ability to heal, as well as a couple valuable supportive skills such as Holy Symbol, which increased the EXP gained by all members of the party. However, their ability to kill things was practically non-existent, and it became less and less existent with each level they acquired, since they were one step closer to monsters that would have even more defense for them to break through. When 4th Job was released, all 3 of these classes received extremely powerful full map attacks that cost a large amount of MP and had no cooldown, meaning you could spam them. Bishops received Genesis. Fire Poison Archmages received Meteor, and Ice Lightning Archmages received Blizzard. Blizzard had the added effect of freezing mobs. While the Archmage Ultimates were more powerful damage-wise due to a passive that 3rd Job mages received, which priests did not, Bishop's Genesis was considered the strongest overall skill in the game due to the fact that it was attached to Bishop. Now the class with the best support capabilities, as well as one of only 2 skills in the game that increased EXP received from monsters, was given the best mobbing skill in the game at the time. This caused a massive meta shift, where the only real way to play was to leech from a bishop, whether it be someone else's bishop or your own bishop on a second computer. Leeching was very unhealthy for the game since it accelerated leveling so much that it discouraged anyone from playing anything except bishop. Once leeching was discovered and popularized around this era, it stuck around for many years in various iterations. There was a patch at some point after the release of 4th Job that nerfed the EXP distribution to discourage leeching, and while it was partially effective, maybe even mostly effective, leeching was still very meta for a long time. Even after the nerf of Magician Ultimates, which gave them all a cooldown, all the way up until 2016 or 2017, people leeched very effectively in different ways. Only in the past few years has it become not meta or even possible anymore. Krog. Krog is a portmanteau of Crimson Balrog, one of the strongest bosses in the game in the early days. Crimson Balrog would only spawn on boat rides to and from Orbis at a random chance. High-level players would often spend a good amount of time just riding the boats back and forth to farm the boss, while low-level players were forced to duck into the safety of the cabin in order to avoid getting one-shot by its abilities and wasting their time having to go back and wait for another boat ride. Band Story. The term band story might sound interesting or exciting, but it's really nothing more than a character simulator that allowed you to put any items and cosmetics on any character. It was a dress-up game for MapleStory, and we all loved it. In fact, I still use a newer, more modern version of Band Story to this day to try out various outfits for my characters. It's kind of a staple if you're a MapleStory player. Fangblade. In GMS version 52 on March 15th, 2008, Fangblade became the first player to reach the then level cap of 200. It was a huge event for us in GMS, and practically everyone remembers him to this day. You can still find an NPC of him in the Warrior's Sanctuary in Parion. The race to 200 was a big deal for us in GMS, as it was for everyone in every version of the game. We watched Tiger rise in level for a long time until he was supposedly hacked and deleted, and then Fangblade ended up reaching 200 first, even though all eyes were on Tiger to achieve that goal. I was a big fan of Tiger back in the day, which sounds kinda dumb to say as an adult. I was a Dark Knight / Dragon Knight main, as my regular viewers might already know, so it was particularly cool to me to see a Dragon Knight on top. When Tiger was deleted and Fangblade took over, I never had the same level of admiration for Fangblade. Him reaching 200 first was a disappointment to me personally, despite him also being a Dark Knight. Potable badges. Potable badge is a term used to describe 2 badge slot items that were previously obtainable in GMS. The first one, the Ghost Ship Exorcist badge, was first released in version 137, the Unleashed update. This update was a pretty major one for GMS when you take a look at it. It's the same update where we received the Alien Visitor PQ and Twisted Aqua Road, which are now both removed from the game, as well as Twilight Parion, level 3 link skills, and the level cap increased to 250. There was also a UI change that looked really weird, but I've never seen video footage of this actually existing in our version of the game, so I'm not convinced it actually happened. I kind of wish I was around for this massive update, to be honest with you, even if just for the experience of seeing that UI that might not have actually come to our version of the game. The second potable badge was added in February of 2017 through the Sengoku High event. It's called the Sengoku Hakase badge, and while it's marginally better than the Ghost Ship Exorcist badge, it's not a huge improvement over it aside from the higher potential tier. If you have either of those, you're gonna be fine. Both of the quests to obtain the Ghost Ship Exorcist badge and the Sengoku High event have been removed from the game and haven't returned. We were told explicitly that they wouldn't. The amount of damage that one can acquire from these badges gets pretty insane. I believe it's an overall damage increase of anywhere from 5% to 10%, which is a very large improvement on an endgame character. The vast majority of players will never see a difference in their damage due to a lack of a potable badge, but a lot of people still want them back. Back when the Sengoku High event was first released with the Sengoku Hakase badge, people were a little bit frustrated by it. Judging from a few forum posts I read, some players had a response more aligned with, why do they keep adding more and more power creep to our game? Though I'm sure there were a fair number of players who were excited for it. It just goes to show you that you really can't please GMS players. You give them overpowered stuff and they whine, you take away their overpowered stuff and they whine. That's just kind of how it always is gonna go. I actually participated in the first Sengoku High event myself. I even have the totems to prove it. Unfortunately, I never opted to buy the Sengoku Hakase badge, though it wouldn't have mattered since I no longer play this account anyway. Star Force. Originally, this wasn't going to be on the iceberg, but it actually has some interesting history. The system we know as Star Forcing today has evolved a few times over the past decade, first being introduced sometime before the Big Bang update in late 2010. I believe specifically at the same time the potential system was added in version 88. When an item no longer had any slots, you were able to use these equip enhancement scrolls to give them additional stats and 1 star upon success. The success rate of these scrolls would get lower with each successive star and would destroy your item if it failed, leaving no trace. Deeper on the iceberg, we'll talk a little bit more about these scrolls and a hack that was used to upgrade items to ridiculous levels. A few years later, in the version 157 update, the Star Force system as we know it today was added to replace the old equip enhancement scroll system. This Star Force system would cost mesos instead of a scroll. Upon failure, if your item was at 12 stars or higher, there was a chance for it to be destroyed, leaving behind a trace of it that could be transferred to another copy of the same item, retaining all of its stats and returning its Star Force to level 12. Or it would just lose one of its stars and you'd have to try again. One of the two. This is basically the system we have today. There's a category of items labeled superior that give better stats per star, with each star costing a lot more. The Star Force system is quite controversial. It's unanimously disliked for its randomness that doesn't feel rewarding, and the fact that it drains so many mesos doesn't help. Fun fact, this patch, version 157 Shining Star Part 1, is the same patch that added pinsalier weapons and armors. I thought that was kind of interesting. They also added new boss accessories. All the boss accessories that we have right now, Aquatic Letter I accessory, Condensed Power Crystal, Silver Blossom Ring, that was all in this patch. Kind of a big one. Level 2, HP washing. So this is a big topic, and it goes hand in hand with a few other entries on the iceberg. Bossing, leeching, Dexless assassins, and more. These all tie in directly to the concept of HP washing, so it's very important we understand it. HP washing is the name given to the strategy that some players utilized in order to raise their character's maximum HP. The basic idea was to acquire extra MP when you leveled, and then turn that excess MP into HP. The way it works is simple in concept and very complex in execution, with many different ways of achieving that extra HP, so let's just cover the basic theory. When you level up, you get bonus MP based on your current int divided by 10 rounded down. So if my class would get 1 MP per level normally, if I were to have 187 int on that character when I level, I'll actually get 19 MP per level. Through some weird trickery that's not really worth getting into here, this extra MP can directly be reset with an AP reset coupon and added into HP, increasing your max HP. So the strategy was to simply get as much int as possible, either through adding it directly and resetting it to your main stat when you were done HP washing, or by wearing gear that was scrolled for int and gaining a ton of extra MP each level, then resetting it to HP to increase your max HP. It gets so much more complicated than what I just described, but this is the basic concept. Now, the issue is multifaceted here. First of all, each AP reset coupon cost $3.10, and you needed hundreds in order to wash your HP to a level that was even worth HP washing in the first place. So this basically created a meta where if you were playing a class you liked that just so happened to have very low HP, unless you were willing to spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars, you were locked out of certain bosses for a while. Not forever, it just required you to be a significantly higher level than the entry level. Another issue was that int gear was not cheap, and even if you could afford it, it could only do so much for your int, so most players who were interested in serious HP washing would add their level up AP to int and reset it later. This added hundreds of dollars to the cost since each individual point required another AP reset coupon, but it also introduced the issue of not doing enough damage to kill things to level up. So if you wanted to heavily wash a character, your only option was to leech from a 4th job magician, which either cost a lot of mesos or a lot of time, depending on whether you bought leech from other players or leveled your own magician on another account and did it yourself. This was not a fun meta and it wasn't very popular. Most people back then would simply opt to use Hyperbody, the spearman skill that temporarily increases max HP, instead of shelling out hundreds of dollars and hundreds of hours just to do something at a point in the game most people wouldn't reach. Hands stat. A long time ago, there was a stat in the stat window simply called hands. Many myths surrounded this stat that didn't clearly state its purpose like other stats did. It was vague and weird while simultaneously being meaningless and one of the biggest mysteries of old school MapleStory. Some people believed it to be as innocuous as letting you climb ropes faster, which was not true. Some people believed it to be as impactful as a factor in determining the success rate of scrolls, where higher hands equaled better scrolling success rates. Also, not true. There were some theories about what it actually did, but until the release of the Maker skill where it increased your chance of crafting better items and lowered your chance of booming an item when crafting with stimulators, which was a short-lived system regardless, it did nothing. Now, the term hands is used as slang in the GMS community to refer to one's skill level and ability to kill bosses, so you'll probably hear it more in that context nowadays. MapleStory DS games. In April of 2010, Nintendo of Korea published MapleStory DS. This is a story-based, single-player RPG that seems cool, though I've never played it myself. It seems as though, despite Pirates having been released years prior, the game only features 4 of the 5 job types, and I'm confident they're all explorers. 2 of these jobs are unlocked after beating the game for the first time, which is kind of interesting, some replayability there. It received overall average reviews among the people who actually had access to playing it, considering it was only ever released in Korea and Japan. We never got an official version in the West, though translation patches do exist. That's all well and good, but talking about the game itself is not really the point of this entry. You see, back when it was announced in 2006, speculation began on various online forums, Mapletip, Sleepywood, South Perry, etc. If it was a popular forum in the mid-2000s wherein people discussed MapleStory, you better believe there was a lot of discussion about the DS game. People thought, naively, in hindsight, that this DS game would be the full MMO ported to the handheld console. Online gaming was still fairly new at this point, outside of computer games, so people went crazy with ideas of playing their favorite 2D Korean MMO on their DS. And to be fair, it wasn't that far-fetched of an idea. The game was not resource intensive. Most computers that were made after 2005 had almost no problem running it, and it was designed for early internet speeds, so having it on the DS really wasn't a crazy concept. I personally believed it would come out on DS and be the full game that I could play on my computer as well, but after spending more than a couple minutes thinking about it, it actually didn't really make sense for it to be the full unmodified MMO. Regardless, it stuck around as an urban legend, as it was announced at the beginning of 2007 and would never see the light of day until 2010. On top of that, for us in the West, we just flat out never saw the game being released, and it was not only an average game, but a massive disappointment for everyone who speculated about what it could be. A few years later, another MapleStory handheld game was released on the 3DS. This game might have come out in 2014, not 100% sure. Information on it doesn't seem to be abundant since, once again, it was not released in the West. Of course, we're not in an Asian country after all, so why would Nexon care about us? This game, however, was very mediocre, receiving average to below average reviews among those who actually got to play it. Original version of the Cygnus Knights. If you're familiar with modern MapleStory, you will know Cygnus Knights as nothing more than one of the many class groups in the game. Explorers, Heroes, Resistance, Cygnus Knights, Nova, etc. When they were first released, however, they functioned quite differently. I actually think old school Cygnus Knights were such an interesting topic that I had originally planned on making a video dedicated to them, and I still might, but instead let's just go over it here for now. Cygnus Knights were released in GMS on July 29, 2009. This was sort of the beginning of a major shift in what MapleStory was, but that's a different topic entirely. Upon their original release, they were very different from the other available classes at the time, which included all original explorers and pirates. Each of the 5 Cygnus Knights were based off of one of their explorer counterparts. Dawn Warrior was based off of Hero, Wind Archer was based off of Bowmaster, Blaze Wizard was based off of Fire Poison Archmage, Nightwalker was based off of Nightlord, and Thunderbreaker was based off of Buccaneer. They each had a unique aesthetic, theme, and playstyle that differed quite a bit from their explorer counterparts and were generally a lot stronger up until a certain point. One of the biggest differences aside from that though was their level cap of 120. Not only was this the first time the level cap was anything other than 200, but it also came with a lot of other quirks as well. Every level, Cygnus Knights received 6 AP instead of the usual 5 until they reached level 70, where they went back to gaining 5 per level like normal. With this growth pattern, at level 120, they'd have the same amount of AP that a level 134 Explorer would have. Their job advancements also functioned very differently. They all took place around a rev and were sometimes very difficult, but the real interesting part is that they often received later job advancement skills early. For example, Nightwalker had access to Flash Jump by the time they were level 30, which was a huge deal back in the day considering only Hermits had the real Flash Jump and Gunslingers had a sort of gimped version of it. And getting a Hermit to level 70 just to access Flash Jump was a very time-consuming process that most kids were not willing to go through. Cygnus Knights, however, were unable to actually reach a 4th job advancement. They got their normal advancements at level 10, 30, and 70, but once they reached levels 100 and 110, they would each get access to a quest that allowed them to unlock one of their Explorer counterparts' iconic 4th job skills. These versions of the skills were usually not as powerful as the real 4th job skills, but they got the job done, especially considering the Cygnus Knight level cap of 120. One of the last things worth mentioning is that alongside the release of Cygnus Knights, there was a new passive skill released as well. Blessing of the Fairy is a skill that still exists in MapleStory today and was first released with Cygnus Knights. There's another skill that functions similarly called Empress's Blessing, but that skill wasn't released with the initial release of Cygnus Knights, so we won't go over it. Blessing of the Fairy is a fairly straightforward skill. Your highest level character in that world, besides the character receiving the skill, will contribute a level to the skill for every 10 levels on the character. Each level on Blessing of the Fairy gave 1 weapon attack, 1 magic attack, 1 accuracy, and 1 avoidability. Keep in mind, these were really good boosts back in the day, especially if you were willing to put in the time to level a Cygnus Knight to 120. You could relatively easily give your main character level 12 Blessing of the Fairy. It was, in many ways, the first incarnation of what we currently know as the Legion system in modern MapleStory. A little bit deeper on the iceberg, we'll discuss another major gameplay impact that Cygnus Knights had, but we have to move on for now because this entry is getting a little long. Iframes. Iframe is a term you'll hear a lot around modern MapleStory nowadays. It refers to the invincibility or intangibility period you receive when using certain skills. Most classes have access to at least one iframe skill, which is a very important get-out-of-jail card you can play if you mess up in a boss or simply wish to avoid a specific mechanic. While this is a very common thing nowadays, it used to be reserved for a few select skills. I believe one of the first classes to really lean into the design of iframe skills was Buccaneer. Using Barrage and Dragon Strike, as well as probably a couple other skills, would grant you invincibility that was very important for saving potions and staying alive in boss fights in the old days. InexPros. This is a topic that was very difficult to find any information on. InexPros, from what I can tell, seems to be the Nexon Forum username of a Nexon employee who was in charge of community management and seemed to have a direct line of communication with the developers. At least they spoke as though they did. If you look up InexPros on Google, you only find a few results which reference them as a trusted source for information regarding MapleStory. It seems they were around for a few years, and unfortunately I was unable to find any information on why they left. Seems they were just a friendly community manager who made a lot of promises for upcoming content that never actually came to light. Codys theme park. This is a mildly interesting topic I discovered while doing research for this video. For those of you unaware, Cody was an NPC that used to appear in Genesis and maybe a few other maps. He was around during the beta and has since served many purposes, usually event related. In the very early days, Cody had dialogue that mentioned a theme park. In fact, he had a whole quest surrounding it, the reward for which was a maple flag. Whether it was a real implication of future content that was scrapped or just a joke, people clung onto it for a long time. When the continent of Masteria was still new and people were excited about the expansions surrounding it, there was a lot of speculation about Cody's theme park. This reached a head around the 5th anniversary of GMS, and there was a big thread on southperry.net about it. Basically, InexPros, who we talked about in the last entry, confirmed that we could see Cody's theme park come to light, and because of that, people believed it would be some kind of event area or Masteria expansion. If you read the thread posted in the description, you'll find a lot of speculation about the new Masteria content. I thought this was pretty interesting, mostly because I never heard about it until doing research on InexPros. Either way, we obviously never received Codys' theme park, and I'm pretty sure at this point, over 15 years later, his dream will probably never be realized. MapleStory Flash games. During the mid and late 2000s, when MapleStory was new and Flash was still hot, there was a massive crossover of the two. I actually have a video on my channel where I played some of my favorites from my childhood, and you can check that out by clicking the card in the top right corner. Or the link in the description, because I'll probably forget to put the card in the top right corner when posting the video. Anyway, MapleStory's Flash games are exactly what you'd think they are. Flash games that are either direct emulations of MapleStory or just fan games. Some were fun, a lot were really bad, but they were a big part of a 2000s Maplers experience. Nebulites. Nebulites are a now removed system that served as another upgrade system for gear. First released in version 107 in GMS, Nebulites could come in 5 different ranks: D, C, B, A, and S. They were, honestly, unnecessarily complicated, and required you to find boxes from random monster drops and then get lucky with opening them. If you got a low-ranked Nebulite and wanted to rank it up, you could use the Alien Cubes, which functioned the same as regular potential cubes, but for Nebulites. You could re-roll it with a small chance to tier up. At some point, whether with the original release of Nebulites or from an update that came later, you were allowed to eventually fuse Nebulites for a chance to upgrade them. It kind of functioned a lot like the Alien Cubes, but you'd lose 1 Nebulite per fusion since you'd turn 2 Nebulites into 1 Nebulite. This system was not one I was able to interact with a lot. During the time they were around, I wasn't a big fan of MapleStory due to a variety of reasons, as I'm sure a lot of people will agree, so I don't actually know too much more about them. Jet and Zen. Jet and Zen are 2 version-exclusive gun-wielding classes. Jet was released in GMS on June 27, 2012 in the version 112 update, and Zen was released in MapleC on October 31, 2012. While Jet is based off of the Corsair class we know and love, Zen is based off a class in Taiwan MS and China MS called Dragon Warrior. When you watch videos of Dragon Warrior, Jet, and Zen, you'll notice a lot of similarities between the 3, at least in their original launch day states. I haven't played any of these classes aside from Jet, so my understanding of them is very limited. However, there is a much more interesting story behind Zen's existence. Eventually, Zen turned into what is effectively a carbon copy of Jet, and that's when things started going downhill for the class. In version 199 in MapleC, creation of Zen was disabled due to supposed development restrictions. On February 24, 2021, Zen characters in Taiwan MS and China MS were converted to the new job Mozhuan, but MapleC did not allow this, nor did they add the Mozhuan class. Instead, MapleC Zen players were simply told to job change to another explorer pirate, and any characters who remained as Zen were permanently deleted on April 6, 2021. This is one of now 2 times in MapleStory where a class was deleted outright without any replacement or some kind of revamp, and MapleC players were not happy about it. Supposedly, the play rate for Zen was really low, but honestly, if you prevent people from accessing a class to begin with while simultaneously halting further development on it, that's the exact outcome you're going to get. This sparked a lot of fear in the GMS community too, since Zen was effectively a reskin of Jet towards the end of its existence, and as of May 2023, it's been confirmed that we're getting Jet removed from all versions of the game as well, which is the 2nd time a class has been removed. Even though it's kind of the same thing. Not really, but kind of. Mark of the Beta. Mark of the Beta is a hat that was given out to all players when the beta of GMS ended. It's the most legacy of legacy items, and you can still find them around in servers today. It's not really anything special, aside from being the oldest item in the game, which gives it infinite cool points forever. Fishing. Most MMOs tend to have some sort of fishing system, and MapleStory is no different in this regard, at least for a while until it was removed. The fishing system in MapleStory was a way players could earn EXP, mesos, ores, and obviously fish, though I'm not sure what the fish were used for. The system was first released in Maple C and was added to GMS at some point, though information about this system overall is hard to find because people just really didn't care about it. It saw a lot of small changes and adjustments over the years and was eventually removed from GMS in the version 2.17 update. There were some items you could get that are still around today and you might see them smegged every so often, but the system overall was never very good to begin with and was just another cash grab from Nexon. GM Hat. The GM Hat, or more accurately the Wizard Invincible Hat, is a hat that is only accessible to GMs and gives 1000 of all stats plus some other stats that don't really matter. They were never really useful for their stats though, and mostly served as an indicator for GMs to be easily recognizable. They even came with a little particle effect that was unique to the hat, making GMs stand out very easily. Kishin Shokan. Kishin Shokan is a skill exclusive to Kana that increased the spawn rate and number of mobs spawned on a map. It had a 5-second cooldown and lasted almost 3 minutes, meaning it had well over 100% uptime, and this skill created a vast number of problems in MapleStory for the better part of a decade. While increasing the spawn rate of monsters seems like a good thing, it had massive implications on the meta, the economy, and the progression speed of the game. The meta shift lasted many years until the inevitable nerfs of Kish that have happened over the past few. Assuming you wanted to progress at the same speed as the majority of high-level players, it was mandatory to not only have a second computer with a second account with a Kana, but that Kana also had to keep up with your main in level so you could go to the same areas, especially after the release of 5th Job and Arcane River, where areas were heavily level restricted. You also probably wanted a chair that would keep your Kana raised up high enough to avoid getting hit by mobs, which would have been expensive in regular servers and locked behind RNG and/or events in Reboot. The economy issue was only really a factor in regular servers where mesos had monetary value, mostly due to black market trading and eventually the meso market. A massive increase in monsters killed per hour caused by Kish also meant that there was suddenly a huge spike in the number of mesos being brought into the game. The economy in GMS was already struggling due to the insane number of botters and hackers who went unpunished for many years, and this only exacerbated the issue. Now these hackers and botters would just play Kana and bring in even more mesos without changing anything. Though the sudden increase did heavily drop the value of mesos, which kind of forced them to play Kana in order to remain relevant at all, which again just exacerbated the problem. Progression speed of the game was sped up so much that many players were able to exhaust all available content much quicker than Nexon was updating, which caused a whole host of issues. Not having anything to do would very easily lead to burnout and quitting, which definitely didn't help player numbers. This, coupled with the rampant botting and hacking, the sudden hyperinflation of mesos and host of glitches and lag, launched GMS into the dark ages where nothing worked and very few people even enjoyed the game. Our update timeline during this era was extended from the usual 6-month cycle to an 8-month cycle, which was sort of indicative of Nexon's ever-decreasing lack of confidence in GMS. Paired with all the issues I just listed that all came to a head after the Kishin nerf and addition of the loot box restricted Frenzy Totem that was extremely rare and did the same thing that Kish did before it was nerfed, GMS was very clearly on the verge of being shut down. That is, until Nexon managed to somehow revive it. Reboot. Just play Reboot is a sentiment repeated heavily after the Reboot server launched on December 1st, 2015 in the version 168 update. Players would complain about how regular servers were too pay to win and would often be met with the response of, well, just go play Reboot, it's the free-to-play server. Reboot was first launched as a server that functioned similarly to RuneScape's Iron Man game mode. Over time, however, it kind of turned into the only way to play the game without spending money to progress in a reasonable amount of time. You bought cubes with mesos instead of NX. Trading was disabled, monsters dropped more mesos, had higher HP, and gave more EXP per kill. This effectively made the game a single-player experience, which was honestly kind of mandatory to fix the issues that developed in the actual MMO side of things. Reboot was the beginning of a revival of MapleStory, where most of the previously mentioned issues were no longer relevant. The economy didn't exist anymore, so hyperinflation no longer mattered. Botters and hackers were much less impactful without an economy, and progression speed, while still being somewhat of an issue, was mitigated heavily by the fact that all players had to start over from the beginning on an entirely new server. Unfortunately, the 2PC meta was still very prevalent and a major part of the game, but it was such a small issue now compared to what it was in regular servers that people didn't really mind for a while. Reboot saved GMS. I think most people will agree with that. Without the Reboot server being launched, there's a very strong possibility that GMS would have been shut down many years ago now. It remains the most popular server to this day, with an average of 60+% of the player base opting to play Reboot instead of any of the regular servers. It is worth noting, however, that over the years, Nexon has made a lot of effort in fixing all the issues that they themselves caused via bad updates and remaining out of touch with their player base. Botter and hacker numbers have been heavily reduced, the economy is a lot more stable, though it still hasn't fully recovered and probably never will until Nexon decides to get off their ass and actually remove Frenzy Totem. While it's still not an ideal MMO experience, it's much better than it was 7 years ago when Reboot first launched. Fourth job skill quests. In older versions of MapleStory, there were quests that each class had to do in order to unlock all of their fourth job skills. Some of these quests were difficult, requiring you to kill bosses or party up with people and do a PQ. For example, the Genesis quest required you to do the Horntail PQ in order to get a drop from a specific mob who only spawned on the last stage of the PQ. Most of them were pretty enjoyable, some were a pain to do. Overall, though, they lent an air of importance to every fourth job skill at the time, and I honestly kind of miss that feeling of unlocking a valuable skill after a tedious quest line. Kerning City Internet Cafe. This is a weird entry because this content was never available to us in GMS. In America, we don't have any nationwide internet cafe chains, so the idea of an area specifically designed to be available only when you were playing from partnered internet cafes didn't make any sense. In other regions and other versions of the game, however, this served as a fun little area where you could rent stronger weapons and grind on monsters with increased EXP, among other bonuses. The screenshots you're seeing are the layouts of the maps within the internet cafe areas. To me, they all kind of look like alternate universe versions of the maps we're familiar with in GMS. Like, if you haven't played MapleStory in many years and then tried to remember various maps from memory, these are the maps that you might come up with, right? PvP. PvP was a short-lived minigame that Nexon tried to implement wherein you fight against other players and compete for points. It's as simple as any PvP mode in any MMO, but it was a clunky mess and was unbalanced in a lot of ways due to classes having inherent differences in attack speed, number of lines they hit, survivability skills, etc. While I'm sure all these things were accounted for in the design of the PvP minigame, it never felt very good, and while it's a fun memory, it's probably for the best that it's no longer in the game. Boss Arena. Added to GMS with the Grand Athenaeum update in 2013, this is something I've actually had no first-hand experience with at all. In doing research though, I've found that it was some kind of alternative PvP minigame where you were up against one other person and you took turns controlling the boss and fighting the boss. It seemed as though it was more balanced than the last PvP minigame, but again, I have no experience with this one, so I can't say much more about it. Town. Town was a KMS and JMS exclusive area that was only available for a limited time while partnered with Coca-Cola. It had some special potions that increased weapon attack as well as some Coke-themed mobs. We never got this in GMS, so unfortunately I don't really know a whole lot about it. Showa Town's censorship. Showa Town is a JMS created area that was added to GMS sometime after the release of Mushroom Shrine, the World Tour region. It's a Yakuza-filled town, and the mobs you fight are depictions of Yakuza members. As I mentioned before, we only got access to Showa Town sometime after the initial release of Mushroom Shrine, and there was a reason for this delay. It was extra weird that ours was delayed because MapleSea received Showa Town and Mushroom Shrine by that point, so why hadn't we? As it turns out, we received a censored version of Mushroom Shrine. CMS decided that the violence was too much and censored it, which is the version we ended up receiving in GMS as well. A lot of the Yakuza mobs' weapons were censored, albeit very crudely. All Yakuza members, upon death, turn into either Tanuki or Cloud Foxes. The weird part is that the gun-wielding mobs still retain the gunshot sound effect. The other major change was the armory. In other versions of Showa Town, there were tanks and swords and various weaponry, but in our censored version, we only retained the nukes and the grenades, because swords are a lot worse than WMDs, I suppose. Level 3. Monster Eraser. Monster Erasers are now removed items that used to be available from Gachapon in very old versions of the game. Collecting them all, as well as a few other items, would complete a quest that could be turned into a number of NPCs for various items. Ever wondered what that burning sword in Perion was used for? I sure did before I researched monster erasers. Maple Admin, Gaga, and Cassandra lag. From roughly the release date of the Big Bang update up until maybe 2016, 2015 or so, it's very hard to find concrete dates for this specific issue, there were a variety of massive game-breaking bugs. One that comes to mind that I personally experienced was severe item loot lag. Every time my pet would loot any item, the game would practically freeze until all the items it was able to reach were looted. This was a huge problem for obvious reasons, but this was also the era of drill hall training, and those mobs used to drop a lot of items, especially when Nexon would hold an event where they'd drop extra items. Anyway, during that period of time, there was a major issue that caused people playing on lower-end setups to experience similar levels of severe lag anytime they were in a town. This period of time had a lot of random NPCs in all towns for various events and GMS exclusive systems. This video demonstrates how, in a town without Maple Admin and Cassandra, the lag is non-existent, but when the player enters the map that has those two NPCs, you can see the frame rate drop significantly. Unfortunately, 2010 to 2016 for GMS was a time of growing pains. There were tons of changes to classes, content, and events, extreme spaghetti code, and as we mentioned earlier with GMS on its last legs towards the end of that era, server issues that impacted gameplay to such a heavy degree that the game practically became unplayable. This was one of those issues. Strength Mage. Stepping back a bit to some really old off-meta builds, Strength Mage was a pretty dumb meme build that people used to do as a sort of alternative to a traditional perma beginner. Whereas a perma beginner maintains the title of beginner and only had access to a few skills that didn't have much impact, a Strength Mage would gain access to a lot more. Max MP increase gave them a lot more MP than a beginner would have, which, when paired with Magic Guard, provided them extra survivability. That being said, mana potions were more expensive than HP potions, so how valuable was it really? Well, that's not where the advantages end. You'll notice that of the two videos I was even able to find, both Strength Mages are utilizing a technique that allows them to teleport right after attacking, effectively ignoring any potential touch damage that could happen in most scenarios, further increasing their survivability. One other thing you'll notice is that they're both level 35. Most information about strength mages I was able to find fell off around the mid-30s, so it was clearly not a sustainable build. The list of advantages goes on, and though it's not that long, the obvious disadvantage is that their damage falls off so hard by around level 40 that they're no longer really useful save for some niche situations. Overall, Strength Mage was mostly a meme build that most people got bored of very quickly. Octopus Death Animation. I assume this is talking about the somewhat gruesome death animation that the octopus mob has. This one's a bit odd, but it kind of makes sense when you take a look at it. On frame 3 of the dying animation, you can see the octopus's eye falling out and what seems as though it could be blood behind the eye on the left as it too pops out. Even when I was younger training on these things, I used to think the animation was a bit unnecessarily gruesome, but honestly, it's not that bad. Golem Death Sound. The death sound for the golem enemies in MapleStory is identical to the wake-up sound for the cyber demons in Doom 1 and 2. This isn't the only instance of a recycled sound effect either, as the game uses a number of stock sound effects for some of the early mobs. ITCG. There are plenty of videos on this topic online that can cover the system more in depth than I ever could, but the simple story is that starting sometime in 2007, Nexon began releasing trading cards for their ITCG. The card game was not the main focus for someone like me though. I was more interested in buying the cards and redeeming the unique codes that each card had. The items you could receive weren't very interesting and were mainly ingredients used to craft powerful items. Over time, the rewards for the ITCG codes seem to have been changed to reward the actual items instead, though information about when and why these changes were made are somewhat scarce. Almost all ITCG content became obsolete with the various Masterio reworks we've received over the years. Bob the Snail. Bob the Snail is a unique lone snail mob that spawns in the map Drake's Meal Table and has been around for a very long time. In fact, he might still be in the game as of making this video. He served little purpose other than a fun little Easter egg, and when he was killed he would spawn a large number of normal snails. There were various myths surrounding Bob the Snail, as I'm sure you might expect by this point, and the most prevalent of them were that killing Bob the Snail and then immediately using a scroll would result in that scroll succeeding 100% of the time regardless of the scroll's success rate. Obviously not real, easily confirmed to be not real, it was just an Easter egg. Hekaton lag. MapleStory runs on an old engine. It's been updated and updated many times, but even the Big Bang patch, which was the largest single overhaul ever received, didn't do a good job modernizing it, and that was in 2010. Hekaton is a giant Critias boss. It might actually... Caden. I don't know how it's pronounced. It's a giant Critias boss that functions as a cross-server 100-player raid. It is among the pieces of content we never received in GMS, so I can't do a great job explaining the actual fight, but it has been speculated that one of the major reasons it was never brought to GMS was because of the sheer amount of lag 100 players in a cross-server map fighting the same boss could bring to the server. If we look at this video of a Hekaton boss fight from Maple Sea where the implementation of Hekaton included a reduction of total players down to 30, the game is still almost unplayable. To this day, MapleStory struggles hard when there are a lot of players in one area, and back when Hekaton first came out, there was absolutely no way the engine could handle that server load, so we just never received the content. Recycling content. I'm not sure on this one, to be honest with you. It's not uncommon for MMOs to recycle content, but on the subreddit, people have been complaining about having the same NX items in various rotations for the past 7 years. I just don't really understand if there's an issue here or not, because we still have thousands of NX items to choose from, and bringing back old NX that people liked is a good thing for everyone who wants them on a new character or who simply weren't around when the rotation was available. The only thing I can think this is referring to is the events and how they're structured. You collect coins and purchase a lot of the same items that are available in the majority of event shops: event rings, arcane symbols, node stones, event exclusive NX. Again though, recycling content in this fashion is not necessarily a bad thing. I really don't understand this entry on the iceberg. Fake bosses. Back in 2007 and 2008, there were weaker versions of the high-level bosses that would spawn in various maps with a 30-minute respawn time. I believe they were introduced for the anniversary event and stuck around for a while, but I can't remember for certain. These monsters were easily identified due to the obvious fact that they were normally not able to appear in the maps they spawned in, alongside the clearly visible sparkles that appear on the top of their sprites. They had low HP and gave decent EXP, as well as dropping valuable cakes that could be sold for decent mesos, especially at lower levels. I remember having a great time fighting these fake bosses when I was younger. It gave me a taste of what it was like to fight the real versions of them. Just a particularly nostalgic memory for me personally. Ultimate Explorer. Remember in the Cygnus Knights entry how I mentioned that there was a major gameplay impact that came along with the introduction of Cygnus Knights? This major gameplay impact I referenced is known as Ultimate Explorers. Let's go over what an Ultimate Explorer is. After getting any Cygnus character to level 120, there was a series of quests you could do that would result in you being able to create a brand new level 50 character. This new level 50 character, which was restricted to being Explorer only, would have a set of Empress equips, some elixirs, and a custom medal that would show the IGN of the Cygnus Knight that allowed the creation of that Explorer, referred to as the Successor medal. This medal was very good, giving 2 weapon and magic attack, but it wasn't the main appeal of making an Ultimate Explorer. All Ultimate Explorers would receive a unique skill based on their job. Every single one of these skills was very valuable to have on their respective class. Soul Driver was basically the best mobbing skill you could get on any warrior. Wind Piercing was honestly not that strong, but still pretty cool. Flame Gear was insanely valuable due to it dealing damage over time, which would allow you to train on very high level monsters at low levels if you were geared to do so. Vampire was one of the most valuable due to the fact that it recovered HP while simultaneously serving as a very strong mobbing skill for Night Lords who desperately needed it at lower levels. And finally, Sharkwave was absolutely invaluable on a Buccaneer due to the fact that it could be cast in the air, making it their best mobbing skill when factoring in mobility. The major restriction here, aside from the long grind in the earlier days to reach level 120 on a Cygnus Knight, was the fact that one of the items you were required to collect for the Ultimate Explorer questline had an insanely low drop rate. It wasn't uncommon to spend 8 hours looking for the paradox you needed just to finish that one part of the quest, and it was a bit prohibitive for a lot of people until they nerfed the number required down to 5. I believe a lot of the Ultimate Explorer skills fell off in usefulness and damage eventually, save for Vampire, which was always valuable due to the HP recovery. However, the boost that they brought almost every class, along with the level 12 blessing of the fairy you received from having a level 120 Cygnus Knight, made Ultimate Explorers almost mandatory for a while if you were planning on playing an Explorer. Supreme Server. This was an interesting topic to research. In EMS many years ago, there was a new server introduced called Supreme World. I believe it was EMS exclusive, so unfortunately it's not something I was able to experience myself, but it seems like it was a really cool challenge server. I'm actually kind of sad I never got to try it. The highlights of Supreme World are as follows. Requires a level 150 character in a normal world. Mobs had higher HP. All potions had a universal cooldown. All skills had a cooldown. Accuracy decreases for ranged classes as they level up. Not 100% sure what this means because it sounds like eventually you'll just be completely unable to hit anything, so I don't know what that means. You can transfer mesos from regular worlds to Supreme World at a rate of 1000 to 1. You can transfer weapons from Supreme World to regular worlds, and they would receive a 25% boost in attack. Reaching level milestones in Supreme World would give you a medal on your main character, with the highest level medal giving 100 attack and magic attack, which is so absurdly powerful. If we had a medal like that in GMS nowadays, it would beat every other medal by such a huge margin. It's not even close. In GMS though, we received something kind of similar with our lab server, which was a challenge server that functioned very similarly, though lab server was much easier, and our rewards were a chair, an Inex hat, and a Legion block, which is honestly very valuable. Where the bar log from and Elfwood. No, that's not a typo or a mispronunciation. Where the bar log from is the title of a track that went unused in GMS. It was said to have been used briefly in the KMS beta in Perion, though it's basically impossible for me to confirm or deny this. Evidently, the name was fixed at some point despite this, and it's now called Where the Balrog's From. I'll be honest, this song creeps me the hell out. Way more than it probably should. I think when I hear these instruments, my brain immediately thinks, oh, this is Perion music. But when it plays and sounds like an alternate timeline version of the Perion music, it unsettles me on a deep level. Even with that association, I think this song is kind of a creepy song in general, even objectively. It could be the reason that it went unused to begin with. One of the other well-known cut songs from the game is Elfwood. This was supposedly similar to Where the Bar Log From, used in Alinea in the KMS beta. People say this is similar to When the Morning Comes, which is the song that replaced it in the official release, but I actually don't hear much of a similarity between the two. There are a few more cut songs that really aren't as interesting, with these two being the most well-known of them. Battle Mage Revamp. In KMST version 1.2.177, there is a proposed Battle Mage revamp. This revamp would have changed the theming of the class very heavily and was scrapped because of the overwhelmingly negative response to the new direction it was given. There's not a lot of information on this, but there are a few videos demonstrating the new skills. This one will probably only be interesting to those of you already familiar with Battle Mage. Level 4. Havoc in Fox Valley. Fox Valley is high-level 4th job content that was released in KMS in late 2017. Within the Fox Valley area, there is an unused NPC named Havoc. The MapleStory lore buffs will already know who Havoc is, but let's cover it briefly. Havoc is Durand Darmore's Apostle of Lightning. He is the main antagonist of the Cernium storyline and the leader of the invasion of Cernium. There's a lot more to it, but all you really need to take away from this is that he's tied very heavily to the grandest storyline, as is Fox Valley. Now, I couldn't find information on the specifics regarding this. Either Havoc was actually physically in Fox Valley and didn't do anything, or he was simply a part of the files surrounding Fox Valley and heavily associated with its existence. Until the release of Cernium 3 years later, people were confused as to why Havoc was appearing within the Fox Valley files. This was obviously answered after Cernium came out and his role in the grandest storyline was revealed. Hard Magnus the Hacker Trap. On January 3rd, 2013, Nexon made an official announcement on the MapleStory website. It reads, "We have permanently banned numerous players hacking the hard mode of the game boss Magnus as well as their party members. We will continue to crack down on abusers to ensure we maintain a fun and fair playing field for all Maplers. Thank you." With the release of Magnus on December 17th, 2012, Nexon secretly incentivized hackers to kill it as soon as possible by claiming that the first group of people to kill Hard Magnus within 1 month of its release would receive a special title called One Who Spearheaded Magnus's Defeat. The title gave 10 of every stat, 10 weapon and magic attack, and 10% boss damage. This title is insanely good even by today's standards. There are 2 problems with this. First of all, Hard Magnus was absolutely, mathematically, unkillable at launch, so the only people who would be able to kill it within the month after its release would have been hackers. Secondly, this title never existed. It was never even in the game files to begin with. Nexon simply lied about giving out a fake reward to players so they could make sure they caught as many people as possible who were trying to game the system. Between the release of Hard Magnus and the announcement posted by Nexon, players were starting to get frustrated with hackers killing Hard Magnus and getting the drops to sell to other players. Nobody had done it legitimately, so having the items in the economy felt invalid. It really heavily devalues the achievement and makes killing a boss pointless if you could just buy the gear from other players who hacked to get it day one. However, when Nexon released this announcement, people were very happy and praised them for the hacker trap. Unfortunately, the praise didn't last long, as a lot of the damage was done before Nexon could fix it. Hackers got their hand on Tyrant capes and sold them off to other players who were either ignorant of the method of acquisition or more likely simply didn't care. Over the next few months, Nexon worked on eradicating these wild hacked Tyrant capes and Magnus coins, and banning everyone who was involved with killing Hard Magnus in its unkillable state, but a lot of hackers had already profited and got what they wanted, so the entire operation was partially effective. Due to Hard Magnus having such a high level requirement though, a lot of high level hackers were banned, which the entire MapleStory community viewed as a victory. Another interesting fact, during this period of time, Kaiser and a few other classes had some massive exploits and bugs that would cause legit players to be banned. This was around the era where Empress gear was still best in slot, and killing her was only getting easier every day. However, due to the number of hackers that would kill Empress, GMs would sit inside the Empress boss room hidden, watching boss fights and banning players they thought might be hacking. This goes a little deeper as well because there's a whole side of things that covers how Nexon's GMs were very ignorant of how the game actually played, and a large number of legit players got banned during this time, but I'll leave you with this. This is a screenshot someone took of Empress Cygnus aggroing onto a hidden GM who was watching their fight. The person who took this screenshot was lucky in that they didn't end up getting banned, but their friend did right at the end of that fight. China MS. I want to preface this section with the disclaimer that I am not Chinese. I've never been to China, and I have practically zero exposure to this version of MapleStory. Most of this info was gathered from a Reddit post by user Angus Fenying, and it's about 3 years old now. When doing my own research on CMS, I found that a lot of these things seem to have been updated and the game is quite different now than it was back then, so I'll frame this more as an historical entry rather than a modern one. So China MS or CMS is the only version of MapleStory available in China. GMS is banned, and I assume all other versions are as well. The traditional versions of MapleStory are already pretty predatory with their monetization practices, but CMS takes it one step further, and then one step beyond that, and then another step beyond that. For starters, the hacker situation was supposedly obscene. The majority of maps in every channel in every world had a hacker botting away freely, and they never seemed to get banned. The sheer amount of hackers contributed heavily to the game having extremely high latency for everyone. Obviously very unhealthy for the game. And while we're on the topic of cheating, let's not forget that their cheat detection system functioned horribly. You would think they wouldn't have even had one because of the number of hackers, but they did, and it falsely flagged legitimate players all the time, resulting in irreversible false bans, either temporarily or permanently. If you thought obtaining gear in GMS was difficult, in CMS, any useful gear was locked behind their lucky draw system. This lucky draw system came in two forms. One is within the game itself, while the other is on the web page. The in-game system was apparently less expensive, but had lower rates for the good items, while the one on the website was very expensive and probably didn't have much better rates. The damage cap in CMS functioned a lot differently than in other versions of the game as well. Starting with the Spark update in July 2013, damage cap was tied to the weapon you were currently using. This meant that they were able to have another upgrade system tied to weapons that was easily monetized. There are some other differences between CMS and GMS that were less impactful, such as CMS allowing players to equip 6 rings, but it seems that recently this was changed too. One of the biggest differences I was able to personally observe was how powerful some of the gear in CMS can get. I'm assuming the gear progression and pay-to-win item availability is similar to that of TMS, meaning every single item you can get your hands on is extraordinarily overpowered. Just take a look at this level 280 Bowmaster soloing some of the hardest bosses in seconds. There's probably more I could cover, but information is hard to come by considering I don't know the language. There's a good chance I got some of this wrong, as it was a very difficult topic for me to research. Hacked by Echo. February 27th, 2010. A well-known and prolific hacker going by the handle Echo gains access to a GM account and spams smegas and notifications for an hour straight before anyone at Nexon puts a stop to it. Pretty funny in retrospect, but a major security concern at the time, since it seemed as though Nexon wasn't even able to keep their own GM accounts secure. Hackers have coexisted with MapleStory. This is a conspiracy theory that claims hackers had a direct connection with Nexon, with some people even going so far as to claim that hackers were paid by Nexon to hack. This doesn't make any sense though, because once you take a look at the impact hackers have had on the game, you realize they're the only reason it almost died before the launch of Reboot. Nexon has never had any incentive to simply remove one of their revenue streams, GMS, especially as a company that consistently acts so greedily and seems to only care about their bottom line. Paying people to make the game less desirable to play and reducing the number of legitimate players paying for their microtransactions is an absurd notion. There's no credibility to this claim at all. Some training areas were popular due to EXP tables not being adjusted. This is a really interesting one to me because it's very vague and hard to understand. The idea here is that since Nexon failed to adjust EXP tables, either for monsters or for the EXP required to level, certain training areas became more popular training spots than others. The problem is I can't find any information on this, and even my knowledge of the game debunks this idea pretty quickly. If you think about it, the only time an area would be a better training spot due to unchanged EXP given by monsters is under one of two circumstances. The EXP monsters give was reduced in an update, or the EXP required to level was increased in an update. Let's cover the monster EXP thing first. As far as I know, there has never been a time in MapleStory's history where a monster was changed to give less EXP. It may have happened once or twice, but never on a scale large enough to cause any sort of buzz in the community. Maybe some stuff with the Big Bang update, but they balanced everything pretty hardcore during that update. Secondly, there has never been a time where the EXP required to level was increased. This has, for certain, never happened. Every time there's been a change to the EXP required to level, it has always been a reduction in total EXP required. So with these two things in mind, it's very hard to understand this entry. But since I want to believe this because it's kind of cool, I thought of one potential situation where this might have happened, but it still doesn't make a lot of sense. When Nebulites were released and the NLC expansion that added a bunch of alien stuff came out, there was a set of maps with alien mobs that was an insanely popular grinding spot due to the crazy amount of EXP those aliens gave. Thing is, I'm pretty sure this was GMS exclusive content, so there was nothing to be changed from the source content. This was the source content. Maybe the fact that it was never addressed until much later could be what this entry is referring to, but again, I was unable to really wrap my head around this one. MapleStory was one of the games that contributed to popularizing the free-to-play model. This is a pretty straightforward entry. MapleStory was one of the first MMOs ever released that leaned heavily into the free-to-play model with microtransactions. It, over the years, alongside games like TF2 and probably a few others, really contributed heavily to making this free-to-play model more common with things like loot boxes and stuff like that. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I'll leave for you to decide. White Lady of Parion. The only real creepypasta ever created for MapleStory. This series of videos is most of the information I was actually able to find about it. Looking back, this could have been a great ARG/horror series, but honestly it's still kind of cool in its current form. The backstory, based on various sources I was able to find, goes something like this. Muriel was a GM in Bara who died in a car accident. Nexon implemented her as an NPC who roams around Parion because her character was a warrior. Her purpose was to catch bots, and she was supposedly removed after the Alien patch, which could mean the patch where Masteria was expanded and Nebulites were implemented, though I don't know that for sure. This is probably one of the biggest myths in MapleStory. It was somehow prevalent in almost every version of the game, at least including GMS and KMS. Those are the only two I can confirm, and it's not unheard of to see people referencing it from time to time. When I was younger and this story was more common to see, I never believed it much. It's a poor attempt at a creepypasta, which I understand is a kind of redundant statement, but it's really all we got. Level 5. Crimes involved with MapleStory. There aren't many of these, but let's cover the ones that we know about. Don't get too excited though, none of these are really that interesting. July 24th, 2016, around 7 AM, a 33-year-old Chinese national surnamed Li, who was in Korea on a 3-month visitor permit, drove a car through the glass doors of the head office of Nexon. He had been drinking and was angry that he became so addicted to the games Nexon made. He claimed that Nexon had ruined his life. According to the police interrogation, he said he was infuriated at Nexon's online games and was so addicted that he could not live an ordinary life. There were no injuries and the only damage was to the glass wall on the first floor. I was unable to find any information beyond the initial story, so it's unclear what consequences he faced, but I think it might be safe to assume that Lee served some jail time. October 2008. A Japanese woman gets divorced suddenly in MapleStory from her online husband, not her real husband. I guess she wasn't married. She was so upset by this that she logged onto his account and deleted all of his items and characters. She was arrested for illegally accessing a computer and manipulating electronic data and was taken 1,000 kilometers from her home in southern Miyazaki to be detained in Sapporo, where her online ex-husband lived. It's unclear whether she was ever formally charged or served any jail time for this. April 3rd, 2020. A Singapore man by the name Chejiehe, holy shit, I'm not going to be able to pronounce that, I'm sorry, pleads guilty to 3 charges of what is effectively scamming. He would get money from other players with the promise to deliver mesos in exchange, and simply never delivered on these promises. He even attempted to make his setup slightly more convoluted by involving an innocent third party and hoping to shift blame onto them if the police got involved. One of the scammed victims made a police report. The police later determined that it was Che who was behind it all, and the innocent third party was never charged. Che received 3 months jail time for these scams. November 26, 2011. Nexon Korea's database of login IDs, passwords, resident registration numbers, and names were leaked publicly, though the resident registration numbers and passwords were encrypted. There was no leakage of bank information or transaction information, so Nexon simply urged its player base to change their passwords to avoid getting hacked. It was never discovered who was behind the security breach and subsequent leak of information. RNG rigging controversy. This might be the single only verifiable controversy that Nexon has ever admitted fault for on this list. But before we get into it, we need to quickly discuss what flames are. Flames, otherwise known as bonus stats, are a system of upgrade in all versions of MapleStory that was added to GMS at the same time of Nebulite removal, which we covered earlier. This is a flamed item. The stats highlighted in blue are stats that have been adjusted by flames, and the green values are the amount of the stat that was added by the flame. It's a simple enough system to understand. However, dating back as far as early 2019, KMS players started to notice a discrepancy where some flame combinations appeared more often than others. The combination that raised a red flag for them was how often all stat and jump appeared together. Nexon was asked about this, and their reply was something along the lines of, "The probability of obtaining one type of stat through Rebirth Flame is not affected by the presence of another type of stat," even though it was very clear to a vast majority of the player base that this was an outright lie. Fast forward to February 18th, 2021, Nexon releases patch notes for the KMS test servers stating that flame probabilities would be equalized, which at least heavily implies that they were not equal before. Korean players were outraged at this outright betrayal and absolutely lost it, demanding Nexon communicate with them and tell them what was going on, what caused this to begin with, and what the future plans were. A few days later, when Nexon finally posted their announcement regarding the situation, not only was the flame logic completely flawed, resulting in groupings and biases towards certain stats such as strength, they also found that the inner ability system was biased as well. Locking in certain lines when rolling inner ability would greatly affect your chances of rolling other specific lines. I remember participating in this system after the announcement and being shocked at just how flawed it was, to the point that it was barely even fair to call it RNG. In typical Nexon fashion, along with the announcement that inner abilities were uneven and not truly random, they doubled down on their bullshit by claiming that they hadn't been lying about their use of the word random, which was an unnecessary addition to the announcement and only served to piss everyone off even more. At this point, people had lost faith in Nexon and began jumping ship to play other games. People started thinking that the cubing system might be rigged as well, which is a fair assumption given the knowledge they had just received, though Nexon explicitly refused to reveal any information about cubes. A week after that announcement, Nexon announced that they would be compensating people who bought flames and circulators by refunding Maple points and Honor points. The original compensation was 10% of the Maple points and Honor EXP spent on those two systems over the 2 years prior to the announcement. Again, this only served to piss off the Korean players who felt as though a 10% compensation for 2 years of flames was kind of just a middle finger to the community. Regardless, Nexon changed this compensation to be more reasonable and explained that their initial implementation was meant to avoid a massive influx of valuable flames that would have had a major effect on the economy. Yeah, they really care about the economy in Korea, but in our version of the game, no, give us frenzy totems and 2x drop cards. One thing that might come to mind as you listen to this story is likely something along the lines of, why was Nexon so stupid as to reveal that they'd been using a rig system for years? Couldn't they have just kept lying like they did back in 2019 and all the years prior? And that's a solid point. They could have just changed it and never told anybody. There was one poster who speculated that, due to some of the history of protests and legal action against their company, they were trying to get out ahead of a newly proposed amendment to a Korean law that regulated the video game industry. As you can see, in 2020, the Korean fanbase of the popular mobile game Fate Grand Order sent a truck protesting the decision of the game admins to take away a certain cash item from being distributed from regular events. As a result, the entire Korean FGO dev team was fired. Around the same time, the Mabinogi player base also sent a protest truck demanding Nexon show greater transparency over their RNG items. These events caught the attention of the media and the political sphere, which was obviously very bad PR for Nexon. While all of this was happening, GMS players, who were obviously very well aware of what happens in Korea, it's the year 2021, for God's sake, were also outraged and held off on flaming anything until we knew what we were getting as well. There is a Sunny Sunday event coming up soon that gave half off for inner ability roles, which is a very valuable event, and Nexon America was rushing as fast as possible to fix the broken inner ability system, since it was now well known how it works and well within a player's ability to roll exactly what they want. This would have resulted in less money from circulators, since people knew exactly how to rig the system, and Nexon America didn't give any compensation for honor points until after the Sunny Sunday event was over. There's a lot more to this story, and it goes deeper and deeper the more you research, but I think I'll stop here for now. The takeaway from this is that despite what Nexon might tell you, there's absolutely no basis for it to be the truth based on their own past behavior. The many bugs, hacks, and exploits. So this is another big topic to cover. It is in the lowest tier of the iceberg after all. When you hear bugs, hacks, and exploits relating to a game that's been around as long as MapleStory has, there's probably a ton of stuff that comes to mind. Item duping, enhancement scroll hacks, monster vac, etc. We'll cover all of these and more in chronological order. Back in the early days of GMS, it wasn't uncommon to find hackers. In fact, it was usually pretty easy to find a hacker or botter throughout most of Maple's lifetime, but that's not really the point. Most of us knew about things like Monster Vac, Item Vac, and the slightly lesser known Mouse Vac, but we'll cover them really quickly. Monster Vac, short for vacuum, was a hack that dragged every monster on the map to a specific point. It was an extremely common method of speeding up leveling and something that was around for many years. This was often coupled with God mode, which allowed the player to sit off screen, unable to be identified or reported by normal players, and they could bot away freely with these hacks with no repercussions. Item Vac was a slightly more powerful version of the Vac pets we have in the game nowadays, just not monetized, so it wasn't allowed. It would loot every item on the map in similar fashion to how Monster Vac worked, hence the similar naming scheme. Mouse Vac was the third well-known Vac type hack. It would attempt to place your character wherever the cursor was. Back in the day, when movement was very limited, having this ability was obviously extremely powerful. A common easy hack that I used to use back in the day was the no delay hack. This effectively removed the cast time on any skill and allowed you to spam it extraordinarily quickly, to the point that it was just about instant. This hack was around for a very long time in many different forms, and was always pretty fun to mess around with in my opinion. Don't hack though. I'm not even sure it works nowadays. You will get banned if you try to hack. Trust me. Moving a little forward ahead to slightly more impactful exploits, item duping was not so much a hack as it was simply abusing the way the client and server code interacted. I've never duped items personally, nor have I known someone who has, so I'm not entirely sure how it works. What I do understand about it, however, is that it essentially allows you to duplicate something in your storage by manipulating the way items are saved on the server. I believe there was also an exploit using the MTS, or the Maple Trade System, which was a now removed system that allows players to trade items for NX directly. Using these methods and some others, players were able to duplicate tons of extremely valuable items over the years, though a large number of the duped items were removed by Nexon, usually not long after the duping happened. Another major hack that I was a victim of myself was the remote hack. This one's scary. Using this hack, the hacker could hijack the victim's account anytime they did anything that caused them to interact with the login server, changing channels, entering the cash shop or the MTS, and maybe a couple other things. I think even relogging would allow them access. The method I fell victim to simply exposed my login information to the hacker via packets sent to the server that they intercepted and read. None of this was encrypted, so it was just plain text sent over the server. Really fucking smart, guys. I don't know if this was the only way it was done, but it was one of them. This hack was eventually patched, but I'm sure there are plenty of horror stories of it happening to people. One of the more interesting and slightly more well-known hacks involved both duping and packet editing. Equip enhancement scrolls, which are still kind of around today, used to be the end game for upgrading gear. Once your equip had no more slots, you could throw one of these scrolls on it to increase their stats slightly. As far as I know, this system was implemented with no hard cap and was gated only by probability. The chances of getting an item all the way up to even 9 stars was very, very, very low, so barring astronomical luck, players were unable to get their equips very high unless you were a hacker. The method of doing this is still unconfirmed, at least to me. Fetz on Reddit, who is a moderator of the MapleStory subreddit, claims that the method involved dropping an item in Happyville's tree decorating map and using packets to scroll it. This is pretty vague, but it's a claim I can get behind personally, since I know how Happyville's tree decorating map has different dropped item properties compared to any other map in the game. All of this equip enhancement scroll hacking took place around the same time a major duplication glitch was going on, so hacked stone tooths and cravens were abundant. I wouldn't be surprised if some still exist to this day in a secret collection. The last exploit/bug we'll cover in this section is the Lionheart Castle spawn rate exploit, colloquially known as glitching maps. Again, I'm not sure exactly how this was performed, but supposedly there was a glitch involving Wild Hunter that allowed monster spawn amounts to increase significantly in the Lionheart Castle training maps. This glitch actually existed in a few more iterations after this initial one, including a glitch that allowed maps to have frenzy-level spawn rates until the servers were restarted. There are probably plenty of hacks and exploits that I'm missing here, and for that I apologize. I don't want to make this single entry that long, so we'll leave it at that. The short version is, partially due to laziness, and partially due to the length of time this game's been around, there have been many hacks, bugs, and exploits, and we've probably not even seen them all at this point. Beta/cut content. MapleStory has a lot of cut content. It's easy to list off everything that's been removed, but we're going to keep it to the early days of the game, specifically around the beta. Let's start with this one that I had absolutely zero knowledge of until doing research on it. Stamps for a green snail, a blue snail, a stump, and a slime existed in the GMS files in the early days. It's unclear what they were to be used for, though it is speculated that they were used for the note system, which is weirdly absent from GMS. I have no idea what this note system is supposed to be, which makes sense considering I've only ever really played GMS. As far as map data goes, there are only a few that were removed in the early days, most notably the old free market maps. The Parion and Hinnesis free market maps were used during the beta. The Elnath free market maps were in the files, along with the Ludibrium ones, but of the two, only the Elnath free market maps were ever accessible by players due to a glitch involving Happyville. All of these free market maps, except for the Hinnesis free market rooms, which were released unchanged, were recycled and redesigned for use in the version of the free market that we ended up getting for many years. There also exist unused graphics in the game files as well. What you're seeing now is the initial version of the UI, based on the Korean MS beta and the first few versions of JMS. You can see this in the screenshots of JMS from late 2004 and early 2005, nearly 20 years ago by the way. There is also an effect that would appear above the player's head when using a skill, and you can see how that looked in this video. You've actually been looking at it through all the placeholder footage also. I vaguely remember these existing in GMS in the early days, but I could very well be making that up. There were some leaked placeholder icons for portals that were apparently used as indicators for Nexon's internal map editor. Whether this is true or not, I'm unsure, but they were in the files. I've come across these myself when digging through the files in the past. In the KMS beta, there used to be weather effects. No clue when or where they were used, maybe like snow in El Nath. I don't have any video proof of this, unfortunately, but these weather effects were eventually scrapped and replaced with the stat-increasing temporary weather effect cache items upon release. Now I want to quickly cover some of the cool things I discovered while scouring the internet for information about the betas and cut content. This is a screenshot from early 2003 of the KMS website. You can see the URL is identical to what KMS uses today. This screenshot is so old that the highest level player was only level 26. I'm not 100% certain on the date or whether this was beta or not, but regardless, it's very, very early into the game's existence. This screenshot is from the early days of JMS, which launched shortly after KMS. This screenshot was taken in October 2003 and just shows the main page discussing what MapleStory is all about. One of my favorite things that was almost lost to time is this initial implementation of hyper teleport rocks. When these were released in KMS, they had absolutely no restrictions on where you could teleport, meaning you would get things like this happening almost instantly. Thinking about having a teleport rock with no restrictions is almost a scary thought nowadays, considering how restricted our teleport rocks are and how careful Nexon is about letting us into maps we're not supposed to access, even though they don't do a great job sometimes. Players were able to teleport back to Maple Island, into people's second job advancement quest maps, and pretty much anywhere they wanted. It's pretty funny to see. One more thing to show real quick is this poster that I found promoting the launch of Maple-C and thanking beta testers. Pretty cool, not much more to say about it. Now let's talk about a source where I found a large amount of information about the beta specifically for KMS. cafe.naver.com/beforebig-bang is a forum where people can post about their memories of MapleStory before the Big Bang update. If you do some digging, you can find a lot of cool stuff like this very old, very low quality video of the KMS beta. All credit for the upcoming pictures and videos goes to the users on this neat little forum. This screenshot from the beta shows a character named Mild Sauce, who was likely one of the highest level players back then, though I never heard of him until researching this. When he reached level 92, the highest level monster available was Toro Macy's, a level 70 monster with 15,000 HP who gave 270 EXP. If we use the first released EXP table, which we can empirically confirmed was used during this period by checking it against the player's current EXP and level, we can determine that in order to level once at level 92 off of Toro Macy's, he would have had to kill 24,709 of them. Not an easy feat back then, to say the least, and that's just one level. This picture is a little sad because supposedly this was taken right before the beta ended and everyone was trying to stay in contact with each other by sharing the IGNs they were planning on using. According to the OP, they never actually met up again. The picture is kind of funny to me though, in a way, because it mentions Ventrilo, which is like Discord but back when the internet still sucked. This next picture is interesting. Spearman is a well-known non-legit player who had a bunch of gear not found on Victoria Island that was perfectly scrolled. Nobody's really sure how he did it, but he did. There was also an incident that occurred once where everyone playing received a notification that simply read "to Spearman." Try as I might, I was unable to find an image of this, but I know it happened. I thought this one was really cool too. This screenshot appears to be of the old player shop interface where players could sell items to other players. I've never seen this before. This is actually awesome. Looking further through the forum, I was able to find even more screenshots of player shops. There's also something that appears to be the equivalent of the free market, just without the free part. It seems as though players were able to open shops anywhere too, as you can see by the number of shops open in the official Perion Potion store. This is what the old trade window looked like, with its weird transparent chat box in the middle. Here's another one I found from KMS, including a Shinkita that was scrolled with 760%. These two screenshots are of the character who I believe was first to 200 in KMS. His name roughly translates to Fallen Power Warrior, and I won't even attempt to pronounce it in Korean. This is another screenshot of the very old UI, and there are certainly some odd things here. First of all, the character window looks very old. This is another UI element I've never seen in action until now, and I kind of like it. It screams late 90s, early 2000s design. The other odd thing here is that this cache item that this character has on has a required level of 10, which is weird. Cache items usually don't have level requirements. Here's another one I'm particularly fond of. This is an early version of Land of Wild Boar 2, a very good training map in old school Maple. I'm talking old school. The major difference here is that the platform at the top used to actually hold mobs, whereas the version I'm familiar with, which came later, is simply a tiny safe spot. This here is the beta character creation screen. Seems as though everything here is the same as the release with just a slightly different UI. You even still have the dice in this early version. And that's gonna have to be it for the beta content. I highly recommend you check out the Naver site and look through that stuff yourself. There's a lot there and it's all really cool. The files. So, we're at the final entry. We've discussed a few dark things. People going to jail because of stupid things they did with MapleStory. People losing all their hard work because they were the victim of an unfortunate hack. But I had to save this for last. There's a reason this is at the bottom of the iceberg.
MapleStory, 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 MapleStory,
As I mentioned briefly in the beginning, MapleStory is a very large game with a lot of history behind it. Covering every single possible thing that could be put on this iceberg would take hours, so I was pretty picky about what I kept and what I scrapped. This video took months to create, and I'm very happy with the result. If you enjoyed this video, check out some of my other videos. Leave a like, subscribe. I make all kinds of content, though my focus is on MapleStory. And I want to thank you guys for watching.